Welcome to the deep dive. You've shared your sources, and our mission, well, it's what we always do. Dig in, pull out the key insights, and help you get genuinely well-informed fast.
And today we're diving into class conflict, but maybe from an angle you haven't considered before. We're looking at the left libertarian view, specifically through Agorist Class Theory.
Right. So the sources are Wally Conger's summary of Samuel Edward Konkin III's work SEK3 and Konkin's own 1973 essay, Cui Bono, Introduction to Libertarian Class Theory.
Exactly. It's fascinating stuff.
Now, I know when you hear class theory, maybe your eyes glaze over a little. You think dusty books, maybe ideologies that feel, well, a bit irrelevant now.
Yeah, it can sound pretty academic or maybe even, politically charged in a way that feels outdated.
Stick with us, though,
Yeah.
because this isn't just rehashing old arguments. This deep dive gets into a pretty radical libertarian take that might genuinely change how you see power dynamics in society. You might have some real aha moments.
Okay, so where do we start? Well, the texts really set the stage by looking back at Marxism, specifically the late 20th century.
Right, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Soviet Union, that whole period.
Precisely. And the general feeling that followed was that Marxism, as a predictive model, as an economic system, had, well, failed. Konkin actually called it a dream.dead.
But, and this is key, the agorist argument isn't just Marx was wrong, full stop. It's more nuanced.
Exactly. The sources we're looking at say, okay, maybe Marx's predictions and economic theories didn't pan out, but his core idea that society is divided, that there's conflict between groups, that part had some truth to it.
But they argue he got the who and the why wrong.
That's the core of it. He misidentified the classes and the real source of the conflict. Konkin had that great line about how in the U.S. back then it felt like only rightist cooks and commies were even bothering to talk about class anymore.
So let's quickly recap the traditional Marxist view, just for contrast.
Okay. So Marx saw the big struggle as between the proletariat, the industrial workers basically, and the capitalists, the owners, the ones who own the factories, the means of production.
And this whole idea stemmed from historical stuff, like master-slave dynamics and his labor theory of value.
Right, the idea that labor creates value. And the prediction was, eventually, the workers would rise up, overthrow the capitalists, and the state itself would just wither away, fade out of existence.
Okay, so that's the Marxist picture. How does the agorist critique take that apart?
Well, they point to a few things that have changed since Marx's time. First, the old industrial working class, it's just not the dominant force it once was in many places.
Economies have shifted.
And you've seen a rise in entrepreneurship, more decentralized ways of working. But the really big one for agorists is the counter-economy.
The black market, gray market, things done off the books.
Essentially, yeah. Peaceful economic activity that the state forbids or heavily regulates. And Konkin observes something really interesting here.
What was that?
He noticed it wasn't just, stereotypical criminals involved. It was scientists, managers, even government workers, people from all across the traditional class spectrum participating in the counter-economy.
Ah, so it messes up the neat categories of proletariat and capitalist.
Completely. It turns Marx on his head, in a way. Instead of this unified working class, you get this fluid group, the counter-economists, who aren't defined by owning capital or selling labor in the traditional sense.
They're defined by what? Risk.
Exactly. United by the risk they take operating outside the state's rules, they just don't fit Marx's model.
Okay, so if the Marxist lens doesn't quite fit with the alternative, this leads us to the libertarian idea of class, right?
Right. And the fundamental shift is looking at the state as the main dividing line. Not capital, but the state.
This draws on older ideas too, doesn't it? Like Franz Oppenheimer.
Yes, Oppenheimer's distinction is crucial here. He talked about two ways to get wealth. The economic means and the political means.
Economic means being, making stuff, trading, voluntary exchange.
Correct. Production, cooperation, the free market, and the political means.
That's using force, coercion, basically the power of the state. Taxes, regulations that benefit some at the expense of others.
Precisely. So libertarian class analysis, like Murray Rothbard's model, says the real class division is between those who primarily use the economic means and those who benefit from the political means. Net taxpayers versus net tax consumers, roughly speaking.
So the state beneficiaries versus everyone else.
Yeah. And historically, the argument in these texts is that the state itself grew out of, roving bandit groups who realized it was more efficient to settle down and just tax people regularly instead of constantly raiding them. Institutionalized plunder, basically.
Wow, okay. So the state itself is the mechanism of class division.
That's the core libertarian insight. But then some radical libertarians took it further. They started looking inside the group that benefits from the state.
Saying it's not just one big happy family at the top.
Exactly. They started incorporating ideas from thinkers sometimes called left revisionists, people like Gabriel Kolko.
Who argued capitalists often use the state to get monopolies. Right, not exactly free market behavior.
Correct. And Paul Oglesby, who pointed out splits within the ruling class, and G. William Domhoff talking about the higher circles, this sort of subtle, interconnected elite.
So the idea is, even among those benefiting from state power, there are different factions, conflicts, maybe big business using regulation against smaller competitors.
All sorts of internal dynamics. It's not monolithic. These thinkers tried to map out those connections, sometimes pointing to groups like the Council on Foreign Relations or the Trilateral Commission as, places where these elites might coordinate.
Okay, so that's the radical libertarian view, adding complexity to the state beneficiary class. How does agorism refine this even further?
Agorism, particularly Konkin's version, sharpens the focus again. It shifts from just who benefits to what people actually do. The focus is on action.
Action in relation to the state.
Precisely. Agorist class theory draws a line between objectively statist actions and objectively agorist or counter-economic actions.
Okay, break that down. What makes an action statist?
A statist act, in this view, is one that involves aggression or relies on the state's coercive power. Think voting, lobbying for subsidies, enforcing regulations, taxation itself.
And agorist or counter-economic acts?
Those are peaceful, voluntary market activities. Buying, selling, producing, but crucially, doing it in ways the state has forbidden or heavily restricted. Working off the books, trading in unlicensed goods, bartering to avoid taxes.
And a really key point here you mentioned earlier is that why someone doesn't matter for this analysis.
Right. Motivation is irrelevant to the classification of the act. Someone could hate the state but still work as a tax collector. That's a statist act. Someone could claim to love the state but run an entirely unlicensed, untaxed business. That's a counter-economic act. It's about the objective nature of the action.
So this creates a spectrum.
Exactly, a spectrum of action. At one end, you have maybe pure statists, people whose entire role is tied to state power, like politicians or police officers when acting as enforcers. At the other end, you've got maybe full-time counter-economists, people operating completely outside the state-controlled system. Think smugglers or operators in purely black markets.
And in the middle?
Well, first, there's what Konkin called the revolutionary agorist cadre. These are people who are consciously libertarian and consistently act counter-economically, trying to grow the free sphere.
They're the ideologically committed ones.
Yes. And then there's the vast majority, the sort of conventional middle class. Agorism sees this group as engaging in a mix of statist and counter-economic actions daily.
Like paying taxes, but maybe also doing some cash-in-hand work on the side.
Exactly. Or obeying most regulations, but maybe, ignoring zoning laws for a home business. Konkin called this group the external marketplace for the committed agorists. They're the people you trade with, who might be persuaded but aren't fully anti-state yet.
Konkin had that scenario, didn't he? The person at the street corner.
Yeah, it's a great illustration. Imagine you're there and you see, say, a police officer, maybe someone who even calls themselves libertarian, but upholds the state's laws, and right next to them, someone selling, untaxed homemade goods, peacefully.
Right.
Agorism forces you to ask, which one is acting consistently with liberty in that moment? It pushes the focus onto observable actions, not just stated beliefs or traditional roles.
It really brings it down to the practical level.
Yeah.
Okay, so this framework, this agorist class theory based on action, how does it claim to solve some of the problems Marxism ran into?
Well, take the issue of why the supposed revolutionary class, the workers, often seem to support the very systems oppressing them, voting for statist parties, for example.
Yeah, that was always a tricky one for Marxists.
The agorist answer is, look at their actions, not their votes. To the extent that people engage in counter-economic activity, paying under the table, avoiding regulations, they are acting revolutionarily, weakening the state, regardless of who they vote for. Their economic actions contradict their political ones.
So the action itself is the revolutionary force.
In this view, yes. Then there's the problem of revolutionary states selling out, becoming corrupt or tyrannical.
The revolution betraying itself.
Agorism's answer is simple. It opposes all states. There's no such thing as a good state, so a state can't betray revolutionary principles because the state itself is the counter-revolutionary principle. Same goes for political parties. Agorism rejects them entirely.
No party politics means no party to betray the cause.
Exactly. And it addresses the waiting game. Marxism often involved waiting for conditions to be right for revolution or trying to reform the system from within.
Which can take forever or never happen.
Agorism says, you don't have to wait. You can start liberating yourself now through your own actions. Every counter-economic act, every voluntary exchange outside state control is immediate self-liberation and chips away at the state's power.
It puts the power back in the individual's hands immediately.
That's the idea. Finally, where Marx saw class lines blurring, agorism actually predicts they'll sharpen, but along this new axis.
The statist versus counter-economic axis.
Right. As the state tries to control more, or maybe if it shrinks, people's actions will more clearly align them on one side or the other of that divide, regardless of their old left or right labels. It becomes about whether your actions feed the state or starve it.
Yeah, so that's a completely different way to map society. The emphasis really is on what you do.
Individual agency. Even small acts, like choosing to barter or use an informal market, become potentially significant acts of resistance in this framework, quietly build in an alternative.
So wrapping up this deep dive, it seems Agorist class theory offers a really distinct lens. It moves past traditional left-right or worker-capitalist divides and focuses squarely on our relationship, through our actions, with the state.
It definitely challenges you to rethink where the real lines of conflict might lie.
Okay, so here's a final thought for you, the listener, to take away from this. Think about your own day, your job, your shopping, your side hustles, maybe even how you handle taxes. Where did those activities fall on this spectrum between statist and counter-economic?
What changes if you start looking at the world and your own place in it through that agorist lens? It's a provocative question.
Definitely food for thought. We really encourage you to check out the original sources if this sparked your interest. There's a lot more depth there.
Absolutely. Plenty more to explore.
Until our next deep dive, keep thinking, keep questioning.